This is a book I read a few years ago, but it's recently come back into conversation, so I'll mention it. Flynn of the Indland by Ion Idriess. This first published in 1932. My copy is from 72 or 73. It belonged to my parents. It's obviously fairly battered up. Yes, it is fairly battered up. And you helped. You chewed on it, didn't you? There was chewing. Okay, so there's two factors here. One is John Flynn of Indland, Australia, that's been described by Idriess. Idriss's character comes through in this one a fair bit as well. So let's talk about the good things and the overall theme here. Idriess has a narrative around the story of John Flynn of the Indland as it was. He was a padre and he travelled around the very sparsely populated interior of Australia. He visited the stations, the miners. He brought them spiritual relief, but he also brought books, individual items, and medical care, which they needed because they were very, very isolated. They were ridiculously isolated. John Flynn is a man who apparently had a lot of enthusiasm for people, the land, and he was an ideas man. But more than that, he foresaw what he could do with the ideas, and he developed them until they came into reality. He was a member of, he may have founded, I'm not sure about that, the Australian Inland Mission, and in a camel, with a camel chain behind him, he did routes of inland Australia to get to all the isolated miners, homesteaders, and just individuals living out in the bush. Sitting on a camel for day in, day out, with the Australian desert not changing very much around, you've got plenty of time to think, and part of what John Flynn thought about was ways to improve the lives of the men and women living in inland Australia. He did that in an amazing way. He must have been a very, very charismatic man, and when he was in society, he made contacts, he raised capital, he brought stories to people who were interested until they supported his ideas. He envisaged a world in which there were a network of nurses stationed throughout the bush so that no one was weeks or months away from medical care. And he got the funding and the capital, and he got the support, and he built them. Initially, there was one nurse in each station. Later on, there were two nurses, so one could go away to someone who needed the medical care, and one still remained in the centre. When motor cars came around, initially they were way too unevolved to cope with the incredibly harsh conditions of inland Australia, but that didn't stop John Flynn, and he kept on trying until that succeeded. He had such a large network that he got a lot of support. After the nurses' homes were established, and after he'd given the cars a good go and successful failure, it was called at one stage in the book, eventually he realised that motor cars were all very well, but the distance and the time was too much for them, and that was when he started looking at aeroplanes, the idea of a plane with a pilot and a doctor, and this was before even Qantas was established. He started sowing the seeds of this idea, and eventually it came into reality, and the first air ambulance service was set up in Queensland. Flynn, at the end of this book, is explaining the rollout that he planned, which of course happened, and it ended up being the flying doctor that we have all over Australia, the same flying doctor that evacuated me from the middle of the Nullarbor Desert in West Australia to hospital when I smashed my shoulder into smithereens. So thank you, flying doctor. Thank you, John Flynn. Without you, apparently, I'd have stayed in the Nullarbor for a long time with a smashed shoulder. Anyway, so all of this is true story, and the true story is amazing. John Flynn sounds like a truly amazing person as well, and the remote parts of Australia, as described, are gorgeous. I loved all those details, and I loved the slow journeys by camel, the depictions of the land, and the few incredibly isolated people who are mostly really individual characters, and in remote areas for hugely diverse reasons. Now, I didn't know anything really about this author when I first read it, Apparently he won the Order for the British Empire after writing 50 books between 1927 to 1969, mostly about the remote and unusual parts of Australia. This is an Australia that few people would have seen, but Idriess apparently did. He travelled extensively and loved these remote areas. He made an effort to bring them to life so that people in the Empire, in Australia even, who had never seen these places and never would, could visualise them. The inland he talks about, I think, is what we'd call the outback or the bush today. He seems to have seen an awful lot of it back when it was new and exciting. He also seems to be promoting a kind of national identity, and it's got a bit of a Wild West mentality. And I think in this style of writing you can see a little bit of a genesis of the backdrop for 50s Australia, which is both good and bad, and I'll talk about that a bit more. So the writing itself, I liked it. I don't think everyone will. In context, I had to keep reminding myself this was first published in 1932, and the styles of writing were very different back then. It's third-person reporter style, often understated, almost always with a good dose of British stiff upper lip. And it was definitely the subject and not the writing itself that kept me going. Though Idriess obviously loved the areas he went to, and he'd have these brief bursts of whimsy as he described them, but the whimsy was almost worse because it was so isolated and you had to go through a lot of fairly dry writing to get to it. Now, the other thing is, well, Idriess obviously had boundless admiration for John Flynn. That doesn't always bring him to life in the way that a modern reader would be used to, and so even that can be quite dry. Okay, but the story at the core of the writing was so fascinating that I could certainly get through it. Now, those are the positives. On to the negatives. They're there too. I believe that more modern editions have been edited heavily to bring them more into the frame of reference of modern world. My copy's old. It hasn't been edited in that way. And so there's some huge negatives in the book. Because of those negatives, I would be very conservative about recommending this book to other people without due warnings attached. So aside from the antiquated writing style, which you either like it or you don't for the subject matter, what else were the 20s and 30s known for? Even more so the 1910s, which was when about Flynn started his journeys. They were known for social smugness, imperialism, patriarchal misogyny, catastrophic environmental choices, and even more catastrophic racism. All of those are there, and sometimes they're there in spades. Now, the social smugness is pretty smug, but consistent with the era it was written, Rule Britannica, etc. I can deal with that. For a 1930s book, the women are treated pretty decently. Women in society at the time had limited choices. Back in civilization, the women aren't treated badly in this book. The outback women have always been a breed of their own, and I think this book really highlights how much of a breed of their own they were back then. I like the way they were represented. I like the descriptions of the immense struggles that so many endured, such isolated bravery as bringing children into life when there is no medical attention at all. Staggers the mind, really. Now, the racism. Well, this too is merely consistent with the times it was written, with the British imperialism and beliefs of the author. I found it very, very confrontational at times to read it. To be fair to John Flynn himself, I never read anything in this book that implied in the smallest way that he ever treated anyone differently by the colour of their skin, by their gender, by their anything. He seems to have been completely and utterly open to any form of humanity and equality. But the author, maybe quite not so much. He clearly shared that unquestioning belief in the superiority of white men, and the writing of Australian Aboriginals is frankly repugnant in every point. There was one paragraph where he was describing scenery. I had to read it 3 times in a row because I did not know what he was getting at when he wrote, "The trail was lovely despite the black imps that infested it." I didn't get that at first. Finally, I had to put it down because I was so angry with it. Black imps. Black imps. You mean the rightful inhabitants whose land you're stealing and poisoning, the people who you shoot when they object to you stealing their land and poisoning them, and who you treat with condescension the rest of the time? It was pretty repugnant, gotta say. It was good for me to read, I'm sure. We read in a very isolated bubble these days. It's good to read something like this and remember that this was, when it was published in 1932, the prevailing attitude of the people who lived here, and it helps you see how the white Australia policy of the 50s came about, because that's the society it came out of. So it's good to see that genesis, but it's difficult for me to read things like page 240 where we hear about partially tamed savages. So in that sense, it's not going to be a book for everyone. It's going to be a book for specific people who need those reminders or are interested in the imperialism as it came through. Now, other signs of the time which angered me less than the racism but saddened me more were the ecological references. This is from the days when the English believed everything on earth had been put there by God for English white men to do with as they wanted to. So mining is everywhere, of course, and the author waxes lyrical on how many cows and sheep are being supported by the land and how many more can be put on it in future when the irrigation problem has been solved by British white men at the Great Frontier. Of course, that was how they saw it. But my heart bled as he described the beautiful, fragile desert with its unique ecosystem being ravaged repeatedly and with no regrets. The native grasses, which at the time he was describing, are in the process of being thoroughly smashed by settlers, and the cows and sheep that he admired so much. So, of course, Australia, the interior never bloomed the way these 20s English white men hoped they would, because the irrigation problem was never solved. Instead, Australia is getting more and more arid, losing water faster and faster as we fail to conserve it. My heart also bled as he described the beauty of the Murray. He described it quite extensively, and that's the Murray-Darling Basin as it is today. It had clean water, it had vegetation, it had unique, thriving wildlife, and that's as it was then. Thanks to the people of the era this book was written by, it is now an era under immense environmental stress and in the process of being ecologically lost forever, I suspect. So, those are my personal digressions. They may be yours if you read this book, but overall, if you can read this book as a tremendous story, as a historical story set during an era which reflected the thoughts and feelings of the author, then it's well worth reading it just to find out more about John Flynn of the Indland, or the outback man who invented the Flying Doctor. It is a phenomenal story in its own right. Thank you for bearing with me. Like, comment and subscribe, especially about his mouth featherness up there.